Thank you for giving me the opportunity to explain this relatively new foundation. We were founded 4 years ago, and ways in which artificial intelligence is helping us make a difference in recapturing lost lives. And I'll touch on the history, on our foundation, on the ways, the kind of data we have available, the dilemmas presented by the project overall, and particularly with digitization. There's a number of experts listening, and the ways in which this data can be used to reconstruct Jewish lives, challenges, and the impact that anti-Semitism has on our work, and particularly in the current climate. The largest known cultural plunder of cultural property in the world took place during the Nazi era. It was a looting orgy of property belonging to Jews and enemies of the regime on a scale that we had never seen before. It was organized by Nazi officials, their allies, and collaborators. The looting was also enabled with the passive support of millions of participants and onlookers eager for a bargain. This is, as we see, Jewish apartments, and people went in shortly after that to also help themselves. The looting and the forced sales, theft, and confiscation of property belonging to Jews and enemies of the regime began in Germany already, and continued with the onset of World War II throughout Europe. The dispossession, in fact, began the day after Adolf Hitler was named Chancellor of Germany on January 30th, 1933. Many of the seized items were dutifully entered by officials into ledger books and inventories to allow for widespread distribution and sales of the confiscated property. Toward the end of the war and in the post-war era, an astonishing amount of this plunder was fortunately captured by a special arts division of the Allied forces known as the Monuments Men. Some people may have seen there's a movie of that title, although there were also several very brave women with them. Among their findings was some of the archival documentation, not just the looted property, which is what is enabling us today to try and match what was looted and lost with the original owners. As we can see here, it was a very widespread looting campaign. The map on the left shows the number of Jews living in proportionately in countries throughout Europe. And these are all countries where looting took place. On the right, this was it's called the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg. This was the central looting agency of the Nazis that was headed by someone named Mr. Rosenberg. And it was a concerted campaign to rob Jews primarily, but also other countries of their cultural properties, enemies of the state. And as we can see, it went from the farthest east corners to, in fact, to Minsk, to sites fairly far east. Sorry, let's move on here. As a result, in 2019, the JDCRP was founded in an attempt to try and begin to retrace the steps of what had happened to this property. And what it does is, in addition, once we were in the process of creating the cross-searchable digital platform, and it will allow entire archival repositories to be linked, not just to look for individual objects in that sense, but to know that the Bundesarchiv in Germany, the U.S. National Archives, that the relevant documents that they have that pertain to the looted art subject will be linked, so that in one central place, we hope it will be possible to find much more information about a single object, rather than having to personally go to archival sites everywhere between the US and Israel. In Russia, we don't have access to a lot of things. In Kiev, there's material scattered all over the world. We also are working, commissioning research projects, very special research projects. I'll talk a little about several now that are on later on our platform. In education projects, because we believe that the awareness of the Nazi cultural plunder was the first step toward genocide, and this crime is almost entirely unknown. Looted art in general is a very controversial subject, as we know. And what is looted in terms of the Nazi era? We talk about art that was seized when Jews were thrown and evicted out of their homes, art that was confiscated outright, and not just art. This is all household property, movable and immovable. But also there's more and more discussion, rightly so, of what we call flight goods, when there were forced sales, because Jews almost immediately after the Nazi takeover of power lost their positions and they had no income. And so they began selling their household possessions for income. And of course, they tried at first to sell the most valuable objects, which were provided them with some funds to buy, to cover their everyday needs. There's more and more acceptance of the fact. It's been very controversial as to whether objects sold by Jewish persons after 1933 are to be considered looted art. And I think there's more and more recognition of the fact that there was no such thing as a fair deal anytime after 1933. Everyone knew that Jews were in distress and that, of course, they would sell at any price so that they could help, in fact, nourish their families. And the amount that was stolen, as you can see here, is really unimaginable. And these are depots that were set up, Jewish ritual objects, of books, photos from Yad Vashem, artworks. It's mind-boggling, and it was mind-boggling for the Allied authorities who stepped in. In terms of data, one of the big questions we have, and we don't really have a comprehensive answer, is what type of documentation exists, in what quantities, where does it exist, and is it accessible? Provenance experts know much of these answers, but in part, even they don't know, because a lot of information has never been brought together and a lot has never been digitized. So there's different kinds of data. For instance, on the left, you see an inventory list that was Einsatzstab. You see this was the main looting agency. When items were taken from apartments, they were entered into lists. Later, they were also turned into property cards, although this is a property card from the monuments men, who in fairly great detail documented everything that they found. We're very grateful for this because it's made an enormous difference in our ability to try and track the goods, also because many of them have numbers that we can use to try and track further what had happened. But in addition to the different types, there's estimates of the quantities. We're talking about millions and millions of data sets. We really don't know because this information has never been brought together. While AI can handle an enormous amount these days, it's still a considerable quantity and brings with it, particularly in terms of the digitization and the machine learning, its own problems. Where is it located? Some of the main places where these relevant documents are include the Federal Archives of Germany, of the United States. In Germany, there's an office for Kunstverwaltung, for they're the repository for the items that the monuments men, the Allies after the war, where they could not find at least countries that where these objects belong. So they gave them to the German government of the time, who now still has possession of several thousands of these. The accessibility is very inconsistent. The search aids are poor. A lot of the material has been scanned, but nothing is, it's not online. And as I'm sure most of you listening know, if we can't make it searchable through OCR and then take it further by being able to name the entities, we can't really track it very easily. So there's an enormous amount to be done with that. There's a lot of ethical dilemmas that we're talking about. For instance, the legal aspects, the ownership. This is very, very complex legal territory, and a lot of it is ethical. For instance, who is right in this dispute? To whom do the works belong today? I mean, we're 80 years later with a lot of this looting. So how do we determine ownership? Does the public good outweigh the fact of the original owners having been stripped of their property? And what takes precedence over unlawful acquisition? Should there be a balance of interest for the public good? Who determines the public good, and who advocates for justice for the victims? It's an extremely complex network of dilemmas that today most museums are involved in this. The auction houses are involved in this. Everyone actually with any connection to the art world is dealing with these very, very difficult questions. I think that, sorry. Here's a case in point that I think can, wait, so come back to that one. First, we're going to do this case. There's a number of mediation committees that were set up after the Washington Conference on Holocaust-era Assets 25 years ago. There's now 5 of them in the world, in the UK, in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands. Where's the 5th one? In France, if I said that. In any case, in the Netherlands, after numerous court decisions, that this Kandinsky painting that you can see here in these articles was for the public good, should stay in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. The Mediation Commission ruled otherwise and overturned in its recommendation the decisions. And for the first time, and that's why I'm showing this, because it was the first time in the Netherlands where always the precedence was given to the public good and the museum's ownership. Finally, a painting was returned to its rightful owners. And this is a very long battle, and we're not this far in most places. For instance, in Germany, there's the case of Madame Soleil. This painting has become, I think, the most famous in the disputes with heirs and museums. Heirs have absolutely no rights to, they have no access to information. They have no right to call the mediation, convene the mediation commission in Germany. It has to be convened by both parties. And the Bayerische Staatsgemälde Sammlung in Munich, that believes it owns this painting, refuses. The family has abundant evidence. It believes that these 5 Picasso paintings were given only on commission to a gallery owner in Berlin in 1935, shortly before the banker Paul Mendelssohn Bartholdy, who owned them, died of a heart attack mysteriously on a Berlin street. And it's never been very clear. And this art dealer survived, Justin Tannhäuser, moved to New York, and in the 60s, he sold these 5 paintings. The 4 museums in the US have settled with the family, acknowledging that there were at least ambivalence about the ownership. One restituted the painting, the National Gallery, and the Bavarian Museum simply refuses to allow the Mediation Commission to intervene. And it shows the complete and total lack, unfortunately, of legislation. I'm not aware actually of any country where there's legislation. There may be 1 or 2, but that that defines these Nazi looted art objects as theft that must be returned. In the United States, we've had some success using criminal laws that apply to various types of looted art categories. But in Europe, there's really very little, and there's more discussion, fortunately, also here in Germany, about finally instituting a restitution law, but there's very little interest in Parliament, although it's in the coalition agreement. The importance of this project is to be able to reconstruct the lives. In the end, this is really not just about data, but it's about people, and it's about linking the objects to the people. As we know, there was a very large participation by Jews before World War II in all areas of culture, science, intellectual life, the arts, the academic world, everywhere where it was possible for Jews to become involved and engaged, they did. And there were, of course, many collectors. But it's not easy to be able to reconstruct these lives. Also with data, it's not so easy to know what's authentic information and what's not. We have messy data, as we know. There's considerable discrepancies when transferring scanned documents into machine-readable documents. And we have to figure out how to reconcile it, also because the discrepancies can distort the information. It can even lead to false identification. And here is an area where AI is bringing new possibilities for us. There's still a variance of data, but we're on the verge of being able to, we have a pilot project, a computer model, where we've brought down the variance from about 15% to, we think, about 3 or 4%. Where we do spot checking. We'll never be able to entirely rule out inaccuracies, but it's certainly a beginning. There's also a problem in reconstructing these lives with the kind of language in these documents. The Nazis used very cold bureaucratic language, and sometimes very contemptuous language, dehumanizing in the ways in which they would talk about people as objects. And it's very upsetting for victims who don't like to deal with this data in these documents sometimes, because it brings back a lot of old family scars and wounds, in fact. So we have to be very sensitive about how we approach this. We've also started some very specific projects. I talked about research. Persecuted Jewish collectors and artists. You can find this on our website under the research section. No one's ever compiled this. It's quite amazing to think this, but we have no list anywhere of those art collectors in Europe who were persecuted. No combined list. There's several individual lists for individual countries, but even those are incomplete. So we've started. We have over 2,000 names on the collectors list and over 1,000 names on the Jewish artists list, for which there's even less information. It's quite well documented with basic biographical information and sources. Anyone who's interested, please take a look, because it shows that just by combining information with the new possibilities we have, how much more we can really learn. And it's also important to think of the gaps that have been left behind by the Holocaust and by the loss of the Jewish contribution to the cultural world in Europe. It's enormous. Jews were active as collectors, as art dealers, as artists, as patrons of the arts, as musicians. They were as journalists, literary critics. They were active in all areas. And when you're active, I think now in these areas, and you know of what the Jewish contribution was, I think it's easy enough to feel what a gap was left behind. It's not something that could be replaced. And that's another reason why I think it's very important to bring it back out and to recover the history, the cultural history of Europe. It's not just a Jewish history. Jews were part of Europe. There's also tremendous challenges for provenance research in all of these areas, because it's very difficult for them to work independently. And when museums commission them to look into objects in their museum, the museums have a one-sided interest. So this is something that we hope will help families, as once we can pull together a number of major archives, that they can start doing some research themselves and have more independent access to this information. And I just want to touch at the end on the impact of anti-Semitism. There's been a real lack of acknowledgement of this crime. I studied art history, and I was unaware of the dimensions of it, and that it was an organized campaign. We didn't learn about it when I was studying, and I don't believe that it is today. There's almost no mention of the looting of cultural property in any Holocaust education programs of which we're aware. We launched several months ago a study of Holocaust education in numerous countries. We can find no real information about it. As a result, there was never a confrontation with what happened. We don't know the dimensions of it because there's so little data that's been pulled together. We don't know the names of many of the perpetrators, or only a small group of people do. And there was almost no consequences for the perpetrators. Many of them went back after robbing thousands, tens of thousands of Jewish families of their property, back to their jobs as directors of museums, the founders of the Documenta art exhibition, as we learned several years ago at an exhibition at the German Historical Museum. Half of the founders of the first team in Documenta in 1955 were either themselves involved in the cultural plunder of the Nazis, or they were Nazis and they had links to Nazi organizations. The historical revisionism that's sweeping today, many national governments who are trying to revise their history. This is a subject that gets lost even further. And with the rising anti-Semitism, there's been immediately a recourse, unfortunately, to the Holocaust with very unequal comparisons of the Israelis to the Nazis, of others saying they're victimized because they feel there's a loss of free speech. If they criticize Israel, they feel like the Nazis. The amount of comparisons to the Holocaust and false equivalencies that are drawn are frightening, and it's having a further impact on the amount of hate. An earlier speaker spoke about this, that we're experiencing in the world today. As a result, it's more important than ever to establish this central platform as a living memorial to those persecuted and murdered by the Nazis, that we don't lose their history. And I think 25 years now after the conclusion of the Washington Conference on Holocaust-era Assets, it's important to know that the rapid developments in artificial intelligence are finally making a vision possible that they had 25 years ago, but technically it was really not possible to be able to gather all this huge, massive information into a central platform, which will, we hope, certainly allow for deepened research so that we, above all, recover not just information about the crime and about the perpetrators, but about the victims and the lives they led and the lives that were lost. And it is of great meaning to the families when they recover even parts of the story of what happened to their relatives. Or one object, one single object can make an enormous difference in the lives of families, in healing, in some small part, the gaps that were left behind in the wounds. So with that, that's what we're doing, and the ways in which artificial intelligence is really making the difference between being able to reconstruct an entire forgotten chapter of the Holocaust.